Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be discussing Unit 3, Day 2, and today we are going to be looking at the failure of imperial reform. You're going to be seeing that with the British, one of the things that they did is they kind of went in and out with the rules and the laws that they were coming up with the colonies, including on taxing with that. So one of the things that the British would do is that they would get really, really strict with the colonies. The colonies, they would be in uproar. The colonies would start boycotting and doing that kind of thing. And then the British would back off of the laws that they made. And then they would just repeat that process over and over again. I like to liken it to a parent. Let's say that your parent has zero rules for you and lets you do whatever you want. And then they go about and let you do that for years. And then all of a sudden they get really, really strict on you and they want to know everything that you're doing and controlling all of your actions. Obviously, as a child, you'd probably fight back against that because you'd be like, I've had no rules all these time. Now, why do I have all these rules? And that's kind of how the colonies were with this. The British would put in all these rules. The colonies would fight back against it. They'd be fine for a little bit. And then the British would try to repeat the process over and over again. So one of the first things that you were going to do is actually look up some laws. These are some of the most infamous laws that were passed against the colonies. And you're going to look up and see what those laws were and what the colonial reaction to those laws were. So to pick up where we left off yesterday, when we're talking about the Great War for Empire, also known as the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. Let's review what the results of that was. So for Britain, again, they drove the French out of all of Canada and the lands west of the Appalachian. The Spanish would be pushed out of Florida, even though the Spanish still owned Florida during that time. And now you have the British Empire dominating all of Eastern North America. You would see British debt would be a huge problem after the war. If you look at that chart right there that shows, it's actually a chart of British debt throughout history. And you can see there the spike during the American War for Independence. And then before that, the 7 Years' War right there. So literally British debt after the 7 Years' War was at a point where it had never been at in history. And so that left the British with what do we do? How do we get rid and how do we pay down on some of this debt? Also, as we mentioned, the British would end the policy of salutary neglect, where no longer would they be leaving the colonies to kind of do whatever they wanted. And as long as they were making money off the colonies, they were fine with it. Partly because of the debt from the French and Indian War, but also because they are going to be taking a lot more active role within the colonies, which is going to lead to that pushback. So more problems. Another thing that I mentioned yesterday is that the British had left military in the colonies to help with protection against the Indians. Now, this would lead to a lot of issues because we already talked about how there was a difference on military strategy. The colonials felt that military strategy should be done one way, and the British felt like that it should be done in a more traditional way. Remember, the colonies had been fighting against the Indians here for a long time and had gotten accustomed to some of the warfare techniques that the Indians used, whereas the British were busy in Europe fighting European wars, which were dictated by traditional type warfare, men standing on line shooting at each other. Remember that we talked about that the colonists considered the British troops very arrogant and demanding. They didn't really like the British troops. The British troops felt the same way about the colonial troops. They said, hey, the colonial soldiers, they're made up of the worst people in society, and they're also very, very undependable. So you have 10,000 British troops remaining in the colonies. Also, you have a weakness of royal governors. The royal governors here in the colonies had extensive power, but often it was shared with colonial assemblies, which, if you can tell, that's going to lead to conflicts because you're going to have a governor that is to represent the interests of the colonies and the British, but more so the British, and a colonial assembly that's all worried about the colonies here. So that is going to cause issues because you're going to have this power struggle between the colonial assemblies and the governors there. This Revenue Act of 1762, you're going to see that tightens down the collection of trade duties, which a lot of colonial merchants had avoided through bribes. That kind of thing would still continue after the Revenue Act would be passed. But you can see this is the British. This is their attempt to try to get control of what's happening in the colonies. And remember, I told you that smuggling and that kind of thing was rampant within the colonies to avoid some of these British taxes and to be able to get other goods. Also, the Royal Navy was instructed to seize American vessels that were carrying any contraband material or anything like that during that time. So remember, the colonies were not supposed to be trading with the French West Indies. They continued to do that. And now the British put some teeth behind that and said, hey, if the Navy catches any of these ships, they can actually seize the vessel and everything on that vessel. So what was the impact of the 7 Years' War on the colonies? One, again, the debt. Interest on the war debt, 60% of the British budget. You would see that the British would double the size of their bureaucracy and their tax bureaucracy and demand enforcement. An interesting thing with this is when we think about the colonies, we always think about taxation without representation, and we seem to think that, man, the burden of taxes on the colonies was really through the roof. But when you look at the actual numbers, the British were paying 5 times the taxes of the colonies. And the British were not very happy about that. And again, most of that went on the more wealthy within British society, and they definitely were not happy with this. Another attempt by the British would be the Sugar Act of 1764, which would actually lower taxes on French molasses, which this upset colonial smugglers because now it was actually cheaper to get the French molasses, which had a tax paid on it, than it was to get smuggled molasses. And this is going to be the same thing that's going to happen when we talk about the Boston Tea Party. When the British actually reduced the tea tax, with the tea tax, they actually reduced it, which again undercut colonial smugglers and others, and people didn't really like that. Again, the Sugar Act would see heavy enforcement of this, and certain goods could only be exported to Britain. And again, that goes along with the whole idea of a mercantilist relationship between Great Britain and the colonies. So you are going to see constitutional objections raised in response to the reforms of George Grenville. George Grenville is going to be one of the more infamous of the British prime ministers with the things that he does. So first objection, the origin of taxes. The colonists said, hey, people are where taxes should originate, and you're going to see colonial assemblies start to raise that. Even here in Virginia, you're going to see the colonial assemblies here. There's going to be a lot of debate about taxes and where taxes should originate. And the colonists felt like in their mind, they said, hey, we know what is best for the colonies, and we also think that we know what's best as far as taxes should go. So when taxes are raised in the colonies, it should be the colonies raising it because we know what we need. The British are just arbitrarily raising taxes, and they're an ocean away from us. We think that we should have the power over that. The people should have the power over that. Also, you'd have vice admiralty courts. This is something that was allowed under the Sugar Act enforcement. And trial by jury would not be allowed anymore. And instead, you would have a British-appointed military tribunal would be used. Usually, these vice admiralty courts were on a ship in a harbor somewhere, and they would be brought on there. Now, the reason that the British did this is because that you're going to see that within the colonies, a lot of times, with enforcement of these things like the Sugar Act and other British laws, a lot of time it would be a trial by jury, and the jury was usually made up of colonists. Colonists didn't like these laws, so a lot of times they would find the colonists that were being put on trial, they would find them not guilty. So as a way of actually, again, putting teeth behind the law, the British put in place these vice admiralty courts, and these would be used to judge whether their colonists were guilty or not. And again, a lot of times with these, colonists were found guilty. So a lot of people were not, again, very happy with this because they felt like it was a sham and that the British were going to find them guilty no matter what. Next up, administrative power of the British state. You can see here, it says British policies would deprive the colonists of some of their most essential rights as British subjects. So the colonists kept bringing that up as well, saying, hey, what you were doing is depriving us as our rights as British subjects. And they said, as British subjects in the colonies, we should have the same legal rights as any British citizen. And you're going to see that later on that there is going to be disagreement within the British Empire and within the British Parliament about how to treat the colonies. Because really, in a lot of ways, they did treat the colonies as second-class citizens and did not give them the same legal rights as an Englishman. And that is, again, one of those areas that the colonists are going to be very, very upset. That's where you're going to hear the phrase no taxation without representation come from. This whole idea of, hey, we aren't getting the rights of Englishmen. And then, yep, their taxation without representation. So in 1765, you would have the Stamp Act passed. And this required, what the Stamp Act was, is basically you had to buy this little stamp showing that you had paid taxes on all court documents, land titles, contracts, playing cards, newspaper, basically anything that was printed and on paper had to have this tax stamp. And this would be important because this would be actually one of the first times that you would have a direct tax put in place on the colonies. Everything before this mostly had been duty taxes and taxes on imports and that kind of thing. And this is the first time that you're going to have a direct tax. And basically, Grenville's response to this was, hey, colonies, you provide for your own defense and the Stamp Act won't happen. Now, he said that knowing the colonies would not provide for their own defense. So that's why he did that. It was almost a way to like antagonate the colonies at this time. Ben Franklin would respond to this. He said, if you choose to tax us, give us members in your legislature and let us be one people. And an important thing to think of is that when we are thinking about the buildup to the American Revolution, we tend to think that from the very beginning, as soon as there started to be issues, that there was this groundswell of people wanting to just declare independence immediately. And that wouldn't actually be the case. Even up to the approval of the Declaration of Independence, you're going to see that a large amount of people actually want to fix the relationship with Great Britain and make it better. And you can see that in Ben Franklin's quote. He is appealing to Parliament and saying, hey, give us members in your legislature. Let us be one people. And at this time is when you're going to see the British Parliament would embrace this whole idea of virtual representation, that the colonies did not have to have direct representation, that their interests were already represented by merchants, sugar planters, and other people who were doing business with the colonies and in Parliament. And as you can imagine, again, colonists did not like this idea at all and said, that is not representation. They are not representing. We need to have people that are actually colonists being over in British Parliament, representing our interests before them. And again, as you can imagine, this fed those feelings in the colonists of, hey, we're considered second-class citizens. We are not considered real citizens of the British Empire. So Grenville will go on to prove a point. He said that this was done to assert a constitutional principle of the right of Parliament to lay an internal tax upon the colonies. So he said, hey, we are proving this, that we can lay an internal tax. He's saying Parliament is in charge. The colonies are not in charge. The people in the colonies are not in charge. Parliament is in charge, and we can put a tax on the people if we want to. Sorry, that's the way it is. The colonies would send petitions opposing the Stamp Act, and again, Parliament would ignore this and pass the Stamp Act. And it's interesting if you look even in Virginia history, in the Virginia colonial legislature, this is going to be when you're going to have guys like Patrick Henry that first step on the scene, who really fight hard against this and really start talking about this whole idea of what the king is doing is bordering on tyranny, which again, that is, you don't want to say that within the British Empire because that could be considered treason, but you're going to see guys like Patrick Henry who come right up to the edge of what would be considered committing treason with what they say. A quartering act would also be passed because the issue was that the colonists were not providing proper housing for the British troops here. So the British would pass the quartering act, which required the colonial governments to provide barracks and food for the British troops and colonies. And of course, we know to the extreme that went that, hey, if you don't provide it, then we can start requisitioning houses and force you to require that. So colonial response to the Stamp Act. So like I said, the Virginia legislature, upon hearing about the proposed Stamp Act, debated how to respond in May 1765. Patrick Henry, who was a brand new representative to the House of Burgesses, and he got kind of lucky because he went at a time when a lot of the senior members weren't there. He showed up when a lot of them had decided to stay home rather than actually going to the House of Burgesses. And he would give a very, very fiery speech against the Stamp Act. And his speech and the resolutions, it was 7 resolutions that Patrick Henry and his group proposed. And it was only, I think, 4 of them actually passed. the Virginia House of Burgesses. But these 7 proposed resolutions would spread like wildfire through the colonies. They'd get up to Massachusetts, and you would actually start seeing the other colonies adapt some of these as well. And even though all 7 of these proposed resolutions were not passed through, all 7 of them were printed in their entirety in papers throughout the colonies. Henry, in his speech, he compared King George to Julius Caesar and Charles I, and said, again, bordering right on that line of treason, he warned that the king might profit from their example. And when you're talking about that, remember Julius Caesar, Brutus took Julius Caesar out, Charles I, he would be beheaded. A lot of people saw that as treason, what Patrick Henry had just said. Now, of course, kind of like today, some people, they'll say something for shock value and then withdraw that statement really, really quick. And that's kind of what Patrick Henry did in this situation. He said this and then he backed down on that. And Patrick Henry actually, he would later reflect on this Stamp Act speech and say, the alarm spread throughout America with astonishing quickness, and the great point of resistance to British taxation was universally established in the colonies. This brought on the war. Like I said again, for the most part, most colonists wanted to fix the relationship with Great Britain at this point, but with Patrick Henry's Stamp Act speech and other things that are happening, you're going to start to see that more and more people within colonial society are getting more and more angry with the British. So why do the colonists object to these taxes? Again, destruction of trade with the French islands, which they had been doing for a long time. They did not want to see that end. Violation of their constitutional principles. They said, hey, you're violating our rights as a British citizen. Again, the idea of taxation without representation. Also, colonial leaders were very skeptical of the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain. And I like to think of it as, again, you have all these issues that are happening between the colonies and the British, but think about Great Britain and the colonies at this time have a long-distance relationship. If you want to make it like a relationship, you can. It was a long-distance relationship. And speaking for the most part, long-distance relationships usually don't work out very well. Sorry if you're in a long-distance relationship, yours is going to work. But usually these don't go very well, and that's what was happening with the colonies and Great Britain. Having an ocean between you really does make a difference. Taking 6 weeks to get information back and forth makes a difference. So, yeah, these are some of the reasons why the colonies objected to these new taxes. So, if you're asking the question, what event is the root of the cause of problems between the British and the colonies, it really is that French and Indian, the 7 Years' War, is going to be the root of that, because that's going to be finally bring to the forefront once the British put in place their control over the colonies and remove this hands-off approach that they had. This is really going to be the root of the cause of the problems between two sides. I put in there Crash Course U.S. History for you to watch, also reading the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which basically would be an early version of the Declaration of Independence for you to read. So as we get closer, we are definitely getting closer to the American Revolution. You're going to see that there's still a long way to go. And as I have said, still there's going to be a lot of convincing that's going to have to happen for the American Revolution, because a lot of the colonists, again, were still not on board with this whole idea of declaring independence from Great Britain. Most of them wanted to fix the relationship with them. So thank you guys for tuning in. I hope that you have a great day, and make sure you get your assignments done there.